Hey 3DMJers, this is Andrea Valdez, and you are listening to the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. Today, you're going to hear 3 of our head coaches discuss loads of topics surrounding RPE in great detail. Jeff Alberts, Brad Loomis, and Brian Miner will start the show by answering an audience question about whether or not athletes might be missing something by not using RPE in their training practice and why we think that is. But before you hear Brian read that question at the top of the recording, and before all the guys kind of dive into the discussion, I wanted to make sure that you all knew what RPE even is as a concept. So to do that, I'm going to play a quick little audio snippet from our Chief Science Officer, Dr. Eric Helms.
You hear lifters say it all the time. That was an RPE-8, or I only had one RIR. But what are they talking about? Well, RPE stands for rating of perceived exertion, and RIR stands for repetitions in reserve. And this is something I actually did my PhD on, so I'm going to explain to you the basics of this scale. It's a 1 to 10 scale, where 10 is max. It means I don't think I could have done another rep, and I don't think I could have done that many repetitions with any heavier of a load. Then every point down on the scale is one different repetition, meaning a 9, I could have done one more rep. An 8 RPE, I could have done 2 more reps. So we're talking about an inverse relationship between RIR and RPE. If I have a 9 RPE, I got a 1 RIR. So that's how you use it. Just be aware that the more experienced you are and the more experience you have training to failure, the more accurate you'll be. And also, if the set is a low number of reps, there's not that far of a distance to failure, you're going to be more accurate as well.
So there you have it. RPE is a rating of intensity that we use a lot when programming training for our athletes, and it's something we talk about a lot in our podcast, which is why the following question was even asked in the first place. So let's go ahead and get into the show. Here is using RPE worth it? With Brad Loomis, Jeff Alberts, and Brian Miner.
Today, we're going to talk about whether or not you should use RPE. So we had an audience question a while back, and I'll just read the exact question. So it says, I hear you guys talk about RPE in proximity to failure a lot, especially when discussing the bigger compound lifts. Is that always necessary? I know it's not for beginners, but does everyone eventually have to start using that method? I really like just running programs based on percentages and making sure my weights go up every few weeks or so. And I've been making gains I'm happy with for the last 3 years. But when I hear it discussed so much in the industry, I feel like maybe I'm missing something. Am I somehow shooting myself in the foot by not learning how to use RPE like all of your athletes? So I'll kick it over to Jeff first. When did you first hear the term RPE? Like, how far into your lifting career?
When I met Eric and Alberto and Brad, they were talking in that jargon. I'm like, what the hell's RPE? And what's this percentage stuff they're talking about? I felt like I was in foreign territory listening to those 3 discuss training.
Yeah.
Because up until that point, it was just like, hey, I'm going pretty close to failure or to failure.
Yeah.
So I would say that I didn't start learning it until like 2011.
Yeah.
Probably in that 2010, 2011.
Yeah. What about you, Brad?
Yeah, well, ironically, I was about the same time. It was about 2011 or so. I think with me, it was just more so a lot of questions because it was kind of like they were assigning values to something that I kind of already did without assigning values.
Right.
Like, well, when you take it to failure, that's an RPE 10. And I'm like, well, okay. So why don't I just say take it to failure instead of RPE 10 or 0 RIR,
Yeah.
And things like that. Like when you don't take it to failure, you got reps in reserve. And I'm like, okay, so why this RPE thing?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think when it first kind of hit the mainstream in resistance training, I think we have Mike Tashir, with Reactive Training Systems to thank for that. And, they coach a lot of powerlifters, and I think it does have a lot of utility for powerlifting and bodybuilding, but we'll discuss that. But, he adapted it, to kind of fit the model for resistance training. And, I think it's been a net positive, but I also think it leaves people susceptible to overthinking their training to a large extent, especially on the bodybuilding side. But I think the first thing probably worth discussing is like why rate a set? Why not just push it to failure? And because most people, when they go in and train, they're, especially bodybuilders, if they're coming from a background of high intensity training, I think most people when they start training aren't intentionally leaving reps in the tank. Especially if you came up through the, muscular development Flex magazine days where everything was high volume, taking everything to failure. But ultimately, it's a tool to achieve a stimulus while managing fatigue. And so when we look at a training program, it's zooming out and deprioritizing single sets to a large extent, and more so prioritizing what's the total area under the curve for effective stimulus across the session and across the week while still, managing recovery. So with that said, did you feel like, Brad, I know you're currently a few weeks out from a meet yourself, but did you find using RPE was beneficial for your powerlifting training compared to bodybuilding?
Yeah, definitely more so really for powerlifting than with bodybuilding, because I feel like the biggest advantage of using RPE auto-regulation for powerlifting is that, well, I guess we should probably back out. Let's talk about percentage-based programming first, right? Because that's kind of what powerlifters followed for a really long time. And so, the classic linear periodization, you would write out an increasing load week by week by week, decreasing repetitions. But the problem with that was, especially with powerlifting, fatigue really starts to mount. And what do you do if program says, I got to do 85% for 4 sets of 5, and you didn't get a good night's sleep, and all of those variables that affect your training and your performance hit you on any given day, right? And a lot of times what ended up happening is powerlifters got hurt. They didn't get injured because that mindset of, well, I can't miss a day.
Yeah.
And the program says this, I got to do it, right? And that's really where auto-regulation saved a lot of people, because it's like it was slowly coming to grips with our bodies aren't in a bubble, and we can't predict how we're going to perform on any given day. And so you can accomplish, or use your terminology, Brian, we can get the same stimulus and remove some of the load, because the body doesn't really know the difference. It knows the effort that is involved. And so then that's when RPE kind of really started gaining ground, when it was kind of like, we need to adjust in a smart way when the body can't perform the way we predicted it to on paper, right? So yeah, that is where, to circle back to your original question, it's kind of saved me. RPE today is an RPE 8 for a single, right? I know that a 3 rep max for me on such and such a lift is this, right? But it ain't today. I'm dieting, leverages have changed a little bit, didn't get a good night's sleep. For me, RPE 8, a 3 rep max is this, And so then I had a single at that, and I just saved myself probably a back injury or over fatigue into the next training session, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, definitely on the powerlifting side is where I have found it the most useful, and it saved me the most.
What about you, Jeff? Have you noticed a difference, I guess, in terms of how you used to train versus now? And how do you approach your proximity to failure now?
Yeah, I'm definitely thinking more from a fatigue management thought process. But before I kind of talk about that, like thinking back to where I came from, coming back from HIIT, Dorian Yates style training, like everything was to failure and beyond. So to now, all of a sudden, like, hey, these guys are telling me like, hey, we need to make sure that you're leaving 3 reps in the tank on a bench press. And I'm like, in my mind, I'm like, it's an ego hit. You're like, what do you mean? You're wanting me to conserve energy here and not take this set further when I can get 2 or 3 more reps here. Like, you're preventing me from getting more stimulus. Therefore, you're going to lessen my gain. So that was that was hard, like bringing some of the ego down and the walls down, especially when you train in that fashion for like 16, 17, 18 years. Now all of a sudden you're got to lower down your overall intensity. So it's kind of a hit to the ego a little bit. It was hard to kind of, do that. But I mean, once you kind of start understanding the reasons behind it, the concepts behind it, like if I'm doing a bigger lift and I'm, obviously going close to failure, it's going to create more fatigue. So the only thing that was saving me in years past was the fact that I was very strategic as far as rest days. So I'd take everything to failure, but then I would have a rest day or two until I get back into training again. So I was able to kind of keep that going. But once, Eric, Alberto, and these guys taught me like how to like use more RPE system, like especially with the bigger lifts, like I noticed my strength levels were actually starting to go up quite a bit. Like now I'm like squatting over 400, I'm deadlifting 500, overhead pressing 200, 225. Like all these lifts started to move better.
Yeah.
It's because of the fatigue. The fatigue was being managed, far better. So that was a big eye opener. And also during prep too.
Yeah.
Because obviously when you're prepping, calories are lower. So the more failure you're going, obviously it's going to be harder to recover from. So, I kind of just learned like, okay, if I leave a couple reps in here, most of these lifts, like muscle isn't going to go anywhere.
Yeah.
But yet I'm getting through the sessions a lot easier and I'm recovering better and I'm sustaining performance better. But it's just it's a big shift when you're used to training really, really hard to now someone's telling me to back off.
Yeah.
It's the same thing with someone who's doing high volume. You say, hey, we're going to cut your volume by a third or half. It's hard because the emotions tend to get the best of us.
Yeah.
What do you mean? What do you mean you want me to go do less? Like I'm gonna lose my gains if I do that.
Yeah. I think we've all been through that. I know, I didn't start training using RPE or RIR until around the same time you guys did, which is when it kind of hit mainstream anyway. So, speaking on the percentage thing, I think is important because what I think is important for people to understand is all a percentage is doing is trying to make a given rep range a certain degree of difficulty, right? And so it's a proxy for a stimulus, but effort is also a very good proxy for the stimulus. And so if we're trying to, use 80% and we're doing sets of 5 or 6, then you could use RIR, RPE instead of that, because for someone who's like, take the average female, there's going to be exceptions to this certainly, but the average female tends to be a little bit more fatigue resistant than the average male. So a given percentage, like 80% for a set of 6 for them, that could be leaving 4 reps in reserve where maybe it was originally intended to leave just a couple, And so by using RPE, the goal is to make the set a desired difficulty. And so like why do we want to do that? So just real quick physiological kind of foundation of this is generally as you approach failure, with submaximal loads, you're going to recruit more muscle. So there's a higher degree of motor unit recruitment, especially with lighter loads. So if you take a 20 rep max, you probably won't reach full recruitment until you're, maybe 2/3 of the way through that set, and just rough estimate there. And so is the goal here is to ultimately be placing mechanical tension on like higher threshold muscle fibers. And so that's where like RIR is probably, and RPE is probably a step closer to estimating that and putting you in that realm than using percentages, especially if there's a disparity in terms of how many reps somebody can perform at a given rep range. So having that effort target rather than, okay, this is my load target and I'm just going to stop at whatever the program prescribes, can be more beneficial for a lot of people. But at the same time, I think it can also hold some people back because one, I think there's something to be said for seeing a load on a piece of paper, like calculated, loading that you're supposed to hit for X amount of reps. You go into that session, you're mentally prepared for it. Whereas if you're just relying on just your subjective feelings going into a session, say you didn't have a great night's sleep and you go in and you perform accordingly, you perform sort of up to your expectations, where like, we've all had sessions where we don't feel great, but we have a prescribed sets and reps and load, and we end up having a great session. And so sometimes how we feel isn't directly correlated with how we perform. And I think that's one reason or one benefit of percentage-based programming is it kind of forces you to step up when maybe you aren't feeling as good. But the flip side can be true where it's digging you a bit of a hole. And so that's where the fatigue management side comes into play. But with bodybuilders, what approaches do you guys take for prescribing proximity to failure? Like if you're working with a novice, intermediate, advanced athlete, does your approach change based off of that scenario?
If I understand your question correctly, Brian, I'll throw you a couple of scenarios. So like it depends largely on what the session looks like for each of those bodybuilders, right? So like for your typical beginner / novice who's used to like basically pushing failure on everything, right? If I have a particular session started out with 2 compound movements and then 3 finishers that are bodybuilding, I'm going to frame it to them such that, look, I don't want you shooting your wad and hitting failure on leg press and squat before we get to the actual, bodybuilding exercises, right? So, that's the kind of person I'm going to frame it that way. I'm going to say, look, don't use all your ammunition on that very first set.
Yeah.
You're going to be wasted, by the time that you get to the stuff that's actually bodybuilding. Whereas with that particular session in somebody that's more advanced, I might have to frame it the other way. I might have to say, look, don't conserve too much energy on those first couple of sets, right? I want effort there. I want you trying hard because it gets you in that sweet spot for those muscle building sets to where you don't have to do 20 sets of leg extensions, 20 reps of leg extensions, right? We can kind of get appropriate effort there to where we're going to be able to get the stimulus that we need in a shorter period of time when we get to, those muscle building sets. So I hope that I answered your question, but for me, it's kind of easier to kind of use a given session for each kind of an athlete.
I think, that makes sense what you're saying. I think where I'm in the back of my mind when I ask that question is a novice, in order for RIR and RPE to work, which I just realized we haven't really even defined what this is. So like our RPE,
Good point.
RPE is stands for rating of perceived exertion. So usually it's a scale from 5 to 10, 7 to 10, somewhere in there. And it's just a rating of difficulty. 9 is typically considered 1 rep in the tank. 8's considered 2. So on 10 would be max effort, last completed rep you can do. And then RIR, for practical purposes, will define is just sort of the inverse of that, but accomplishing the same thing. I think it's personally a little bit more intuitive, especially for bodybuilders that didn't kind of come up using RPE, like a lot of powerlifters may have. So RIR is just reps in reserve. So you leave a 0 RIR would be the last rep you can complete. 1 RIR, you're leaving 1 rep in the tank. So I where I'm kind of coming from this question is, in order to judge that, we need to know what max effort feels like, right? And so that's kind of our anchor from which we're measuring all of this. And so I think it can be a disservice for some novices to use RIR when they don't really know. Like sometimes they need encouragement to actually
you have
push.
to teach them how to
train
actually
hard.
go to failure.
Exactly.
Exactly. Because, novices and intermediates, that their failure, like their defined failure is going to look different than maybe someone who's far more advanced.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is the form and technique good from A to B?
Yeah.
And are they truly going to failure? So it's actually teaching them that skill, because how do you gauge what 2 reps in the tank feels like if you don't even know what failure is?
Yeah. Exactly.
So that's the first teaching tool, is like teaching them how to actually train hard.
It is.
Sometimes, maybe they are training too hard. It's like, okay, we need to back off.
Yeah.
But in most cases, you have to push people. You have to teach them how to actually do that. So watching form videos is pretty important. And that's why when I program someone who's fairly new or even intermediate, like I'll make the program very basic, very simplistic. And if I'm going to teach them how to get to failure, it's going to be on, let's say, a lateral or a curl or a tricep press down. It's not going to be on a squat or a deadlift, obviously. Like, we don't want them to get injured. But I'm going to take these smaller exercises and watch how they train. Because oftentimes when you're watching that, and especially if you're watching it with them, you could point out things like, hey, I need you to move this way. I need you to slow the rep speed down here, or what have you. Or, hey, I want you to, we need to push one more rep out here. We need to compose your mental your processes, control your breathing. Maybe take a slight pause here so you can get that one true rep that's going to get you to failure. And then a lot of the principles that you're using for maybe like a lateral, you can start applying to other exercises, because a lot of it's just principle based.
That's a great point.
So that's kind of like the first step. That's like the first step. And then from there, like when you program, you got to think about, okay, if I do have an athlete going to failure on some of these, how's that going to impact the exercises that follow? How that's going to impact the next training session,
the week
or 2 or week, like you just mentioned, Brad. Sometimes even, further out than that, like a month. So that's kind of how I kind of think about it. It's like, okay, let's see if they know it.
Yeah.
Like going to failure actually feels like, and if they don't, then we need to teach that.
Yeah. It's interesting. There's research on comparing like novices to well-trained athletes and where bar speed is in relation to their like max effort. And it seems as if advanced athletes can, their max, their RPE 10, for example, there's an observed lower bar speed than there would be for somebody who's novice. So, which makes sense.
Makes sense.
So like if you're a novice, what feels like an RPE 10, it might look like 5 in the tank visually for somebody with a trained eye for it. And I don't know if I've told this story on this podcast before or not, but when my wife, Kelsey, and I started dating, we were training at like a 24-hour fitness one time, and she was doing like pec deck, and I was training with her, and I said, okay, I want you to do 10 here. And she got to like 9. I'm like, all right. And then she hits 10, and she's like, okay, that's all I can do. And I was like, wait, if you do like 10 more, we'll get a puppy. Like, not thinking like, not thinking there's no way in hell that she's going to get 10 more and she just kept going, It's, and we already had a dog at this point. So I think she didn't hold me to it, but it goes to show like novice athletes, beginners, there's a degree of skill required to push to failure, but there's also you're usually stronger than you realize out of the gate, even with that being said. So I think I tend to prescribe, if I'm using RIR, probably lower RIRs than I may for an advanced athlete early on, just because I know that, I'm not going to have a novice train squats to failure just because that's, so I might say, okay, 1 to 2 reps shy of failure, just knowing that it's going to at least push them in that direction to kind of gain that skill set.
Close enough. Yeah.
So, but yeah, I think.
Do you take the rep ranges into consideration? Like I'll base like reps in reserve based on a rep range that we're using.
Yeah.
Like higher rep ranges, I know, okay, I need to get them closer to failure.
Yeah. And so
in order to get that motor recruitment.
Yeah.
Or if we're lower rep ranges, I know if I assign, let's say 3 in the tank, I'm pretty safe knowing that I'm going to probably get enough stimulus out of that.
For sure. I think when it comes to kind of the physiological underpinnings of this, it makes sense why that would be true. You know, if you recruit based off of the force demand that's presented, you know, to meet or maintain force output. So if you're doing like a 5-rep max, you're going to get close to full recruitment, or you probably will get full recruitment out of the gate, you know, from rep 1 on.
Okay,
so you're getting mechanical
1, yeah.
tension regardless. And so, the meta-regression that Zach Robinson, he's with Data Driven Strength, that he published, I think it was last year, they showed, you know, there's likely a benefit training a little bit closer to failure for hypertrophy, but the relationship wasn't as strong when the sets were lower rep. So with heavier loads, it seems that you can get away with training probably a little bit further from failure than you can with like a 20 rep set, for example. So, which makes sense when you kind of understand what causes mechanical tension, you know? So yeah, I to answer your question, I do consider that. And also the movement being performed, you know, even if it's a squat, and we're opening with a squat, kind of as Brad alluded to earlier, if I have them train really close to failure on their first exercise, then that total area under the curve is going to be less, because they're going to sabotage their, you know, secondary and third movements that they're performing, and they're just not going to have anything left in the tank. So yeah, I tend to be on average a little bit more submaximal out of the gate, especially if the reps are more moderate. And then kind of as the session goes on, I might push people a little bit closer to failure. What about you guys?
Well, I was going to ask you guys, getting back to the baseline. Do you ever have athletes that are, you know, unfamiliar with RIR, just like do an introductory week where they just do one set of everything to failure to kind of get them somewhat familiar with it?
Yeah, I think I have done that. And I think there's pros and cons to that. Usually I oftentimes won't open with that, because I want to make sure they can go to failure safely. You know, I don't want them doing it, you know, in this reckless form. So once I trust that they're proficient enough in a movement where, you know, we're hitting the target musculature, you know, the way we want, then yeah, I think there's advantages of that. And I still think there's advantages, like, you know, near the end of a session, the last set of a muscle group, you know, I oftentimes have people just take it to the house and see, you know, if they can beat a prior performance or something like that. But yeah, I think there's a lot of utility to getting them comfortable with how failure feels early in their training career. And I think that's where some people are inadvertently kind of falling short when they're starting out right now, because there's so much information out there now about this that, you know, we'll get the question, you know, someone who's been training a year, like, was this a 4 or was this a 5 RIR? And I'm like, we're asking the wrong questions here. You know, it doesn't matter really. Like it's not like there's this tipping point where it's like all of a sudden this rep is now effective, like this line in the sand. There's, you know, a spectrum, and like you know, there's kind of a sweet spot where you want to be pushing enough where velocity starts to go down. That's sort of where I conceptualize where things are probably productive at that point.
Because, you know, it's challenging, though, even for me, and training 38 years, I like, if you told me, hey, Jeff, I need you to leave 4 in the tank here or 5 in the tank, I'm gonna have a hard time even now, like, knowing what that is.
Same.
Is it gonna be 3?
Yeah.
Is it gonna be 4 or 5? I mean, you tell me 3, I think I could probably gauge that pretty closely. It's gonna end up probably being 2 or 3 maybe in the tank. If you tell me 1 in the tank, it's probably gonna be 1 in the tank.
Yeah.
Like 99% of the time, I would be pretty accurate with that. But to ask someone who's relatively new to the game, or even intermediate, like, hey, we need 4 to 5 in the tank here. Like,
it's tough.
Like you said, it's going to be a really great area there.
Yeah.
So when I program reps in reserve, like, I just base it on a rep range that I'm like assigning, and I'll just like make sure that it's going to be hard enough to where I know the effort level is going to be appropriate.
Exactly.
and I try to simplify it for people as much as possible. So they're not in the, like, how many times have you seen people in the gym, like a commercial gyms, you see guys kind of just going through the motion, like they lift the same all the time. Like, you know, they're not logbooking anything.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But then you see other guys that are like, kind of like concentrating, like they're not concentrating on like the form and quality. They're like, was that 4?
Yeah.
Was that 3?
Mm-hmm.
Was it 2?
They're auditing.
Like, we don't want that.
Yeah.
That's counterproductive too. Like, I would rather just say, I need you to go as much as you can get, but before you think you're going to fail, just stop. Like, just leave one there so you don't get hurt. Yeah. Because eventually they're going to be able to gauge where true failure is at.
Yeah. No, I think that's
I have
go ahead, Brad.
Well, I was just going to say, once I kind of am with somebody for a while, and to really kind of drive the point home of Jeff, like you were saying, to leave 4 reps in reserve, that's, really vague. But I've got a little table that I will create for people, especially when I can tell they're visual. When they're visual like me, and they really kind of understand things when they see like numbers and things like that, I've got this little table where I say, okay, now this is the week that we talked about, where I want you using a load, that's like a 12 rep max on everything. And I want you going to failure to where you cannot get another one. Of course, I'm very, very cautious. Okay, let's make sure that you can bottom out on the leg press and still get out from underneath the thing so that you don't get squished. I don't do this with squats, and even though bench presses is a really good way to tell when you're close to failure, I usually don't, because I don't really trust your average spotter in the gym. But I have a little table, and once I'll kind of say, okay, with this load, you got 15 reps, which basically means, and then I can just copy and paste. 14's 1 RIR, 13's 2 RIR, 12 is 3 RIR, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And once they lay that out, and I kind of have that all plugged into their table, they start understanding the concept of 4 RIR, 5 RIR, et cetera, and then what that feels like, and then of course, now they're kind of able to not only understand RIR better, but kind of what I think of as the backwards of RIR is RPE, because I always think in terms of 10. If it's a 10 rep max, if I got 9, it's 1 RIR, that's an RPE 9, right? If I got 8, well, that's an RPE 8, that's 2 RIR. And once I can visually lay that out for them, it's like the little light bulb comes on, and they kind of understand it better. Now, they don't really understand why I want them training to 4 RIR. They don't understand why, I want them to leave 4 reps in reserve, et cetera. But at least they understand the concept better. And that was kind of the point that I wanted to make from that. So anyway, Brian, I'm sorry. I made a big old tangent there from your question.
No, that's great. You actually, when you mentioned the table, I was going to see, I'm sure, Brad, you're probably familiar with this, having a powerlifting background, but Mike Tashir's table that has like RPE down the side, reps at the top, and then there's approximated percentages of 1 RM. So, a 3 out of 7, you find the corresponding cell, and there's, a approximated percentage. Now, it's important, like what I'd mentioned about people with a percentage. Some people are just more fatigue resistant, and they can knock out a lot more reps than others at a given percent. But I find if I'm working with a power lifter, like I like to give them a approximated load and an RPE. So especially if it's a 5 RPE or 5 RIR, like we don't need to have that perfect. Like it's going to be submaximal enough where it's probably not driving the bulk of the training stimulus anyway. So it's like for there, I can just I might lean more on percentages there, whereas I might push more towards like the subjective rating on things like top sets. But oftentimes when I use percentages, I'll use a table like that, and I'll say like, okay, this is the approximated load. The goal though is we want this to be a triple at roughly a 7. And so adjust accordingly, but at least it gives them kind of a spot on the map to kind of work with. So they're not just, in the dark. But so I think if you only use RPE, it is a coach. I think that can be sort of a disservice working with powerlifters specifically. I think having some assigned loading in there, or approximated loading is probably a better way to put it, in conjunction with RPE really helps people to kind of dial that in a little bit. But yeah, that's a great point that you brought up as well.
Hey 3DMJers, this is Andrew Valdez popping in super quick to let you know all about our new free newsletter called 3DMJ Thursdays. It's a bi-weekly educational email of practical tips for serious lifters of all types. And as I'm talking to you right now, recording this little spiel, we released our first one a week ago, and the next one will come out a week from today. So we're just trying to alternate weeks with the podcast every other Thursday. And that first one was all about inside-out programming, where we discussed the 5 crucial steps to creating a customized bodybuilding program. And it's just a short, actionable, and to the point little piece of advice write-up thingy, which is exactly what we want to keep on doing with these emails. You can read that first issue and sign up for future posts at our website, 3dmusclejourney.com. There's a link to the newsletter in the top menu, in like the middle of the page, and the sidebar, and honestly all over the place. There's also a direct link to sign up and read previous issues in our Instagram bio, and we're at Team 3DMJ on Instagram. We plan to keep sending these articles, insights, and announcements every couple weeks for free to all of our email subscribers. So if you were on our old monthly roundup newsletter, or if you're already a member of the Vault, you already get these 3DMJ Thursday emails, which you probably already noticed when you got the first one, and we'll just keep on sending them to you. But again, if you're new and you want to read the first issue and sign up for future ones, go to 3dmusclejourney.com. Click one of the many newsletter buttons you'll find around there and get these free resources sent directly to your inbox a couple times per month. That's all. Thanks so much for listening to our podcast, and enjoy the rest of the show.
What do you tell guys or gals that they're in the failure camp versus the reps and reserve camp? Like, what's like, because it's always like, nah, bro, you should be going to failure to get more hypertrophy. And then you got this camp saying, no, you need to manage your fatigue better. Like, so what's pros and cons? Like, what's right, what's wrong? Because there's always like, what's more optimal? Well, like for me, like coming from, because I've seen both sides, a lot of it's just ego kind of getting in the way of like hearing each other's sides. And then actually like using both sides to your advantage, because I do that all the time. Yeah. So how do we kind of address those different camps to get them in the middle?
I think in order to have that argument, which this rarely happens where people have the full context of someone's program when they're debating this, but you need to know what their overall program looks like. If they're training to failure on every set and they're adamant that that's the way to go, you have to consider, okay, is this their personal bias because they've trained this way since the get-go? But also, like, how are they managing fatigue? And to your point earlier, Jeff, when you were training kind of that high-intensity approach, when you felt run down, you would just take an extra rest day. And so that's a way to auto-regulate. And so they're probably still auto-regulating, but just in a different manner. And so I think pointing that out to people is important, that, you know, eventually, if you're not managing fatigue, like, an injury will deload for you. You know, like you're going to end up having to do something. And some people can, you know, avoid that. And I look at people in the, you know, a standard bodybuilding gym, you know, the gym that I go to here in town. It's nobody's logbooking anything, but there's plenty of impressive physiques that are doing this just kind of what appears flying by the seat of their pants, you know, that they're just taking everything to failure. And so I can't say, looking at someone's physique, like, okay, this person obviously trains to failure versus leaves, you know, reps in the tank. Both can be very, very effective. And so it's just managing the recovery based off of whatever structure you have. And so that's why a lot of the programs that are higher intensity tend to have lower amount of sets in them to, you know, compensate for that. And, you know, the programs that are often high volume tend to be a little bit more submaximal is a result. And so I think at the end of the day, you probably end up in a similar spot. And I think a lot of it largely comes down to the personality of the individual and what they enjoy doing. You know, I've worked with athletes that, you know, were kind of new to RIR, that we put together a program that looked very sound on paper, and they said, you know, I'm not enjoying this as much as I used to enjoy training, pushing very close. And that's fine. I think you're going to get the most out of your training with what you enjoy and you can do, you know, consistently. So I don't think there's a right or a wrong answer, because people never bring all context to the argument. And so that's the first thing, is like, we don't want to pass judgment on somebody's decisions based off of one piece of training, you know, one training variable that they're discussing.
Yeah, and to put a little bit of kind of visual to that, I guess. When I first started doing bodybuilding, I was very much a max OT guy, you know, and so it was very much body part split, you know. And when you're only training, you know, your legs once a week, your chest once a week, your back once a week, there was two foundational principles of max OT. Number one, go to positive failure. You know, go to where it was basically an RPE 10, RIR 0, right? Number two, be efficient. Get in and out of the gym in 45 minutes, an hour tops, you know? So when you have that kind of an approach to your training, number one, volume's going to be low. I mean, usually 6 sets, 7 at most on chest, you know, legs, quads, etc. You were in and out of there, 6, 7 sets. All of them were to failure, or at least positive failure, right? And then you were out of the gym, you know, and if you're only training once a week, you're getting 6 or 7 sets of chest, you know, a week, right? So obviously failure was very manageable there. Well, then Brad starts getting quote unquote smart, and he says, oh, well, you know what? Twice a week frequency is better. I need to start training chest twice a week. And that was the only variable I changed. I left everything else in place, right? So now I'm training chest twice a week, same approach, 7 sets of workout, going to failure.
Double it.
I'm hating
Doubling
training.
the stimulus.
Double your volume, man. With the same intensity.
I double the volume, I double and the same intensity, exactly. And then I'm hating training, you know? And then guess what happens on my squat sets, you know? I'm doing things twice a week now on my squat sets. And I'm sandbagging on the second day. I'm leaving reps in reserve, right? So I changed a variable in frequency without changing the other variables, and I went very quickly from the failure, the 0 reps in reserve camp, to I got to leave reps in reserve in order to get this frequency that I'm after, right? I didn't plan it that way, but mentally my brain was telling me, this sucks. I don't like training anymore.
Yeah.
If I'm going to do this twice a week thing, sure, one of them can probably be 0 reps in reserve, but that other one, it sucks. I'm not doing it anymore. You know, I don't care if my body is going to put up with it. I don't care if it's the best way to grow, bro. I ain't doing it.
Agreed. Yeah, with that, especially with the frequency and, you know, increasing volume considerably, like the bottleneck for people can sometimes be just enjoyment, you know, or lack of, you know, to keep something going. Like what looks great on paper may be more optimal, you know, within a study design. When you put it in the real world, you know, in the context of a full program where you're not just doing like leg extensions and leg press, you know, for 8 weeks, like that it starts to, your resources are much more limited. And so you also, you might, you know, if you increase your frequency and your knees start hurting, like that's going to be a bottleneck for you. And so that needs to be factored into your decision making when it comes to how much volume you're doing and how close you're pushing to failure. And so kind of the way I go about this is if somebody's just very kind of has that hardcore bodybuilding Dorian Yates style mentality, then generally their training is going to be a little bit closer to failure and the frequency is probably going to be a little bit lower.
Lower. Yeah.
And so then if somebody's just like, you know, it's hard to really see them push close to failure, that visually it always seems like they're leaving a little bit. Like there's plenty of people like that. And it's not a bad thing, but you may need a little bit more volume to get a equal stimulus. So I think, once you factor in frequency, proximity to failure, joint integrity, enjoyment, like all of this shit works. Like it just depends on what you can stick with for the long haul.
Like I enjoyed HIIT when I did it. Like that's otherwise I wouldn't have done it for 16, 17, 18 years. But I still enjoy doing it today. I just can't do it all the time.
Yeah.
Because I won't recover. I'm going to have aches and pains. And there's days where mentally, I just, even if my body's feeling good, I just don't feel like pushing that hard. So it's like, well, okay, instead of doing 2 absolutely just crazy ass sets here, maybe I'll do 3 or 4 and I'll just leave 2 in the tank.
Exactly.
Leave 1 in the tank, leave 3 in the tank. So it's like, it's a question that I kind of asked too. It's like, okay, am I going to get more stimulus doing 2 sets to failure or 4 sets with 2 in the tank? It's probably splitting hairs.
Probably, to a large extent.
So in the end, I'm probably getting roughly the same amount of stimulus, but I'm managing my enjoyment better. I'm managing my fatigue better, keeping stress lower, minimize. And that's the thing with training is you want to try to keep your training environment as stress-free as possible. So you're getting the most out of it.
Yeah, and I think also one thing, pushing to failure, it's less daunting now for me than it was early on. And I think a lot of that is just execution of the movements has gotten a lot better over time. So anytime I always use back squats as an example here, where like to move the weight from point A to point B and really hit like a true 0 RIR, like there's going to be a lot of compensation in a squat for most people. Like hips will start to kick back. And when that occurs, like, got to ask yourself, okay, what is causing that to occur? And usually it's the target musculature. Say you're squatting for your quads primarily, like it's no longer able to meet the force demands. So you're reallocating those demands. And so really your quads have kind of reached, it's kind of like a drop set essentially for your quads. You're reducing the demands as you go across the set.
Good way to put it,
so if you're taking things to failure where you're stopping once the target musculature is, the limiting factor, it's not as much of a psychological gauntlet as it is like taking a back squat to failure. And so there's kind of a difference there between kind of the perceived effort for powerlifters than there is bodybuilders, because powerlifters, like the way your squat looks on the platform doesn't really matter much, So if you're in a high intensity phase and there is some compensatory actions going on, like it's probably not the end of the world. But if you're training for hypertrophy, whether it be for bodybuilding or for powerlifting, you want the target muscle to be the limiting factor. And that often occurs earlier in a set than I think most people realize, especially on compounds specifically.
Well, and especially too on compounds where you can easily cheat and it make it feel like that I am got lots of reps in reserve when I don't, when I actually failed and I'm actually post failure now, So the example I make there is how many people do we see doing that good old fashioned hitch in the gym on their pull downs and on their rows, They start out strict, with the back rigid, and there's not a lot of movement there. And then before long, they're basically doing a clean. It's like a reverse clean, They're bringing the weight back with their lower back, and then they're jumping back into it, and they're like, I got 5 reps in reserve. And I'm like, you started doing that 5 reps ago.
Yeah, exactly. Or like, I beat the logbook today.
So that even... Exactly.
Moving the needle.
Yeah, perfect. Perfect. But that's a perfect example of a masking of RPE in a way. It's hard to grasp RPE when, like you said, Brian, when the movement is not real clean to begin with. And so sometimes stricter, I'm not in the camp of like, super, super, super strict reps, but at the same time, it sure is helpful when you're trying to define proximity to failure and you're trying to define RPE, If you are now leaning back on that curl, and doing a semi-clean, you failed long ago. And more importantly, that bicep muscle failed long ago. You're no longer moving that load with your bicep anymore.
It's gone from a pull down to a row. Yeah, it's essentially.
Exactly. And so when you're trying to figure out and you're trying to assess where is my RIR and my RPE on some of these movements, you got to kind of shift more so into that kind of Nazi strict reps camp, because it's easier to get in touch with the muscle that you're trying to move the load with. And when that muscle is failing and you're now compensating, like you said, with the hips kicking back on the squat, and things like that. So yeah, I feel like, because I'm very much, long ago, I was very much in the camp of the more free reps, you know what I mean? And so that was kind of one of the reasons it was hard for me to grasp RIR. It's because, my heart and lungs haven't given out yet. Never mind the fact that I'm reverse cleaning this bar on my pull down. So it feels like I got tons of reps in reserve left, So I think that's an important point, and that's kind of something I didn't even think about talking about. But when you mentioned the form, the movement, the way that you're moving the load, it is very important.
And I think, when it comes to the whole purpose of autoregulatory tools is managing stimulus and fatigue cost. And so if you're compensating, taking something to a 0 RIR where it's like you're heaving your pull downs and you finally hit failure, that's going to have a significantly larger cost than if you're keeping things strict, And so I think when people look at training to failure and they assume, it's too much fatigue, oftentimes when they clean up their technique, it's not that bad. You just kind of hit a wall, it's not, you're not really grinding through and compensating. You just reach a point where the muscle, it's like, I can't produce any more force. And it's not as like systemically fatiguing, to kind of use that term. It's more, muscularly fatiguing. And I think that makes a big difference in how you frame the conversation when it comes to RPE and RIR. And then one thing you had mentioned earlier, Brad, about, our bodies mostly just perceive the stress imposed on it. So you can still get a really good stimulus, if you're using lighter loads. And I think that's definitely true. By definition, it's a lower stimulus because, it's less mechanical tension. But sometimes that's what you need in order to manage fatigue. Like if you try to dig through that, then you're just exacerbating the existing issue, and I think that's where sometimes people need to, they need to understand that a step back is actually a step forward in the long run. And that's ultimately what RIR is trying to do, is keep you from bottlenecking due to fatigue within a training program.
Yeah, because all too often it's like you mentioned before, it really kind of depends on the person's background as to not only whether or not to use RPE and autoregulation, but then also how to use it, right? Because when you're talking about your power lifters and your goal is to move X load, on the platform, it's very hard to get them to understand that using X load with your regular speed, which right now is hurting you, it's not exactly the same thing, but it's very similar if we lightened it up and then did slower tempo, slower eccentrics and things like that. And now you can get the stimulus that you're after, that your body's really going to recognize more than anything, without loading your axial system with this heavy load that, you basically is causing you harm right now. And then the other side is the bodybuilders, right? With the bodybuilders, it's like, well, I understand that you're searching for the fatigue and the intensity of a lot of volume, a lot of repetitions, and a lot of sets, right? But you can kind of somewhat apply more mechanical tension, get less repetitions, and you're going to basically accomplish the same thing. It's going to feel different. Yeah. But to your body, the stimulus is going to kind of be the same. You're no longer going to reach failure at 20, 25 repetitions, with the higher mechanical tension, you're going to get that same feeling, that same speed of the load, but now it's going to come at 12, in 15 repetitions. So that's kind of something that is it's, in my opinion, it's almost mandatory when you're really trying to get these concepts across. What is that person's background? And then to confuse the issue, you've got me, who is started out as a bodybuilder using kind of a power lifter-ish type program in max OT, where it was low frequency, go to failure, low reps, things like that. But I thought that was just kind of important, was that consider what your background is, and then kind of start taking in these concepts. Because ultimately what it's all about is just getting those muddy reps, getting that into that sweet spot, while managing your fatigue and keeping your performance up.
Agreed. Let's talk a little bit. I mean, talk about the benefits of RIR and RPE. What do you think are some of the benefits of training to failure? Because I know for me, like my background, I started off training everything to failure pretty much, and I still enjoy doing that. But there's phases where it's like I'm just mentally not engaged enough to make that an effective way to go. So, so I kind of go back and forth, just depending on the day. Some days I'm like, I would rather train a few reps shy of failure and just do an extra set, and so each set's not stressful, And then there's other days where I'm pressed for time and it's like, all right, let's get after it. Let's knock out 2 hard sets and move on to the next thing. So you don't have to fit into one camp or the other. I think that's another important point, is like these should all be tools that we use. And if
you have the understanding of the principles,
exactly,
just like what you're talking about right now, is understanding the principles.
You can use the tool for the right.
Yes, failure can be effective, but you don't need to do it all the time. If you're short on time, like, okay, let me get low volume, go high intensity. I'm getting a good, adequate stimulus there. I don't feel like pushing hard, or I have more time. I want to be in the gym 2 hours, and I want to watch NBA playoffs while I do it, because that's me lately. Maybe I'll do 4 or 5 sets here, but I'm going to train sub-maximally.
Yep.
And my muscle isn't going to fall off the next day because I didn't go to failure today. Doing enough volume in this session with enough stimulus to keep it around. So it's just as you and I definitely recommend exploring this stuff. If you've never trained to failure before, explore it. And maybe you do run a month of training where it's like most of your stuff is to failure with low volume. Like, give it a whirl, take data on it, use the logbook, see what you get. Now explore higher volumes with less intensity. See what you get. It's logbook it. And then you can kind of and you get more comfortable knowing yourself by doing that. Like, I'm actually seeing better progress doing this, or I'm doing better with this other thing. So that's how, I think all of us now, we're at a point now where we said we have no spreadsheet right now, none of us. We have no program written down on paper, but we say, hey, we're just going to go in there every day and we're going to try to get some type of stimulus. Based on how you're feeling and what your environment is in that day, I'm pretty confident all 3 of us can probably have a good workout.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
With confidence. I not wonder and come out of it going, did I do enough? Did I do enough? Did I do enough?
Yeah. And you gotta kind of have an awareness of yourself too. And this is where I love to contrast myself and Jeff, because Jeff, he pushes close to failure, very poised. He doesn't make a peep. He barely grimaces, And when
I'm
he's
really
done,
not training hard, Brad. According to some camps, I'm soft. I'm not going to failure because I'm not making shit faces and all that. So
and that's it. That's why it's important that I bring this up, because I've been there with you. And I had one client said, I want to train just like Jeff. I want all my reps to be super slow, so I'm purposely slowing my reps down. And I'm like, you don't understand. You haven't seen Jeff train. He is putting maximum effort into those repetitions, and especially those last ones. They're just going slow because the fatigue is mounted, and he's still putting maximum effort in there. And that's why I really appreciate Jeff, is because he can do that, and he's just like a duck on the water. Underneath the water, his feet are just going like crazy, you know, but on the surface, he's just cool and poised. Well, then on the other side, there's me, and I'm dying, you know, and there's snot coming out my nose, and I'm grunting and I'm spitting, you know, I'm very expressive that way. And so because of that, I'm like you, Brian, I will kind of tend to say, you know what, either A, I'm going to leave some reps in reserve and just kind of get a couple more sets in here. But at the same time, I can't live like that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I kind of know that there's some milk to be kind of squeezed out of there if I kind of make myself get into that camp of those hard repetitions of the really hard, you know, high effort repetitions. So there's a certain amount of awareness to know. And the other thing is I'll cheat. And Jeff called me out of this one time. He was watching me do a set, and he's like, you look like you're trying to hurry up and get that done.
Yeah.
That's what
And
it
I was
looks like when you train. I'm like, where
well,
are you going,
shit, yes,
man?
I am.
Like,
It hurts.
like, where are you going? Like, you're trying to go somewhere faster than you probably should be. Where are you going?
Yeah. I'm like, well, shit, yes, I'm trying to get it done. It hurts, you know? And so I'm aware of that as I'm in a set, you know, and I'm trying to, okay, Brad, stay calm.
But that's just it. You got to learn
keep the
how
tempo.
to, like, in the fire, because shit hurts, it burns. It's like, how do you react to that?
Yeah.
It's like,
you got to know
if
how
you're
you
like,
respond
I don't
as
like
a
the way
person.
this feels. I'm in a
Exactly.
hurry to get it done. Then that's when you see people lose their form. It's breaking down.
Mm-hmm.
They're rushing. They're trying to jerk the weight up. You start, like Brian was talking about earlier with the squat, you start to compensate, right? Because that muscle you're trying to target can't do it anymore because one, you just lost your poise. So now it's all these other muscles are trying to move the weight.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. You got to have that awareness of how are you as a person? Where do you fit? And that way you can start understanding these tools and using them to your benefit.
It's a great point.
Stay tuned for the next podcast when Brad and I go over training when he comes down to my house in May. Out of curiosity, Brian, what goes through your mind like when you're in like this last, like you're trying to get this set to failure 1 in the tank and, you know, it's starting to burn. You know, you got 3 in the tank. You're like, okay, it's starting to hurt. Do you like, what's your thought processes or do you even think?
I was kind of thinking about that when Brad was describing that, because there's times where I go into a session thinking like, all right, I don't know if I have it in me to really push to failure, you know, to a 1-0 RIR in these movements. Maybe I'll just go a little bit more submax and tack on an extra set or two. But once I get the session going and I'm where I would probably stop normally, like in terms of if I'm training submaximally, sometimes I just think to myself, like, it's not much more effort. Like, I'm already here. Like, let's just knock out a couple more reps and then not have to do that additional set, you know? So there is that conversation going on, but, and I think, you know, it is easy sometimes if you feel like you're somebody who is in that high volume camp, but you're checking the boxes on your last couple sets. You're like, okay, I need to do this just to get it done. So I give myself peace of mind. So I'm not upset with myself for skipping it. You know, I think that's what a lot of people do. And powerlifters are notorious for this because they emphasize the big 3 and then, you know, someone's a 650 pound deadlifter and then they're doing RDLs with like 185, you know? So it's like, all right, come on.
Checking the boxes.
If you're deliberate, if you find that you can stay deliberate for 2-3 sets and that 4th set, it's just kind of trash, then it's probably not, the juice isn't worth the squeeze there.
Toss it?
Yeah. I would toss it. And honestly, we've talked about this before, you know, my volume has definitely come down in probably the past 5-6 years. Some of that's out of necessity, just being busier and everything, but doing 4 sets of anything right now, unless it's like an isolation movement, it just feels like that jump from 3 to 4 just feels like such a drag sometimes. And so I remind myself of that, like, okay, let's take care of business these first 2-3 sets, and then you don't have to worry about it. You know, then you can move on. But 2 sets is like the sweet spot for me. I would rather do more exercises and just do them for a couple sets than do, you know, 5 sets of a movement, you know? So, So I've kind of been experimenting a little bit with like lower volume, slightly larger number of exercises depending on the muscle group. And I enjoy that. It keeps me engaged, and it feels like each set I'm focused, So if you feel like your focus is, if you're kind of ADHD, it's like, okay, let's change it up, and it'll keep everything a little bit more deliberate. So,
you know what I think about, Brad? When I'm in that last rep or two,
I would love to know what you think about that keeps you so calm. Yes.
control the emotions, control the load. That's it. Like always control before the load. So if I'm like really zoned in, I'm poised, it's moving super slow, of course, but all of a sudden the form just starts to deviate just a fraction. That's it. I'm done. I don't try to force anything. I don't try to leverage it. Like, I'm done. I'd rather just cut that off there. And even if, let's say, I'm 3 reps away from where I wanted to be, I can always do another set. It's like the hardcore guys that go, you got to take everything balls to the wall, faces, eyes bulging out of your skull, bloodshot eyes, just red. And they think, okay, this is cool because I'm pushing myself to complete failure. I'm like, I can conserve energy by stopping short and just doing another set. So there's ways around always training to failure.
Yeah.
And then vice versa. So like Brian talked about, he can be more efficient, but cutting volume down. So it's, again, bringing these two extremes like to the middle area where we tend to find a lot of success.
I almost kind of wonder if physiologically, if that has a little bit something to do with it, because like there's a lot of times where I know I've got 3 good reps in reserve with good technique, and that one's burning really bad, and I want to quit now, and I'm having trouble staying poised. But at the same time, I know I've got 3 reps in reserve here. I mean, I know it's burning, I know it's hard, but I know I've got 3 reps in reserve here. I better get at least 1 or 2 more. And that's when I start to panic. And I'm like, I got to get 1 more. Let's hurry up and get to it. Because I want to try to get at least 1 or 2 repetitions of those 3 in reserve. You know what I mean? So I almost kind of wonder if physiologically, it's just like my puny little muscles are built differently than Jeff's massive,
Well, yeah, they are built differently because mine are bigger.
Exactly. Maybe you've got more of the type 2A and I've got more of the type 1B.
But no,
and,
seriously,
all those kind of things.
So let's say you're struggling, right? You're like, oh shit, you're panicking. I got to get these 2. What rep range are we talking though? If it's 8 to 10, squash the set, do another set when you're more composed. You have to rest it a couple of minutes because you're going to get enough mechanical tension, right, Brian?
That's right.
Okay, so if you're in let's say you're 15 or above, and you're trying to squeeze out like 2 or 3 more, that can make it maybe a difference because now you're using lighter loading. So maybe you do need to push a little closer to failure.
Because that's always where it hits me, is if I'm using like 12, 13, 14 rep max load, or I'm going to fail at one of those repetitions, it hits me at like 8.
Well, maybe you just need to drop your rep ranges down on that exercise. So instead of,
and that helps. I've noticed that helps.
Just drop the rep range down a little bit. Now it's more of a sweet spot. You have more form. You're composed throughout the entirety of the set. You can push closer to failure. That would be more ideal. Then
I've noticed
trying to fight this feeling like I gotta look like Jeff doing this. Like, well, obviously it's not working out. It's not working out for you. So let's change the approach.
Yeah, because I have noticed that, like, if I'm using a 12 to 14 rep max and it sets in at 8, and I've got to get about 10 to get those 2-3 reps in reserve, if I drop that down and use like a 10 rep max and it hits me at like 6, I stay a lot more composed on 7 and 8. You know what I mean? And I think it's just the time. It's less time spent. It's just a couple seconds shorter. Because that's when I start to panic, is when the set gets longer and longer and longer. You know what I mean?
Well, I think there's more like metabolic stress. It's just more painful training in higher rep ranges. So you just want to get it over with. Like that, I'm not a huge fan of like sets of 12 to 15 unless it's like a lateral raise or something like that. But Yeah, the time element. What I tell myself when I get to that point on the high rep sets is like, I just wasted 30 seconds getting to this point. Like, let's just finish.
Exactly,
We'll
getting to that
finish the
sweet
job
spot
now, you know? So like, if I stop now, then it's like, this is just kind of a waste of time. Probably not fully like realistic, but
the only exercise where I do above 15 is leg extensions, and that's just because of my knees and the way my machine's kind of designed. Like anything less, that's going to feel horrible, just too much loading. But even then, like I can't go 15 to 20 reps straight through, because failure, it's not going to be failure from like muscle failure. It's more like stamina and endurance, lactic acid buildup. So what I do is I go, okay, let me bang out 10 in a row, somewhere in there, pause. Now I rest, pause. I'm going to pause for about, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 seconds. Do 2 more, and then I'll do 2 at a time. Then I go 2, rest, 2, rest, and then I go 1 at a time. And that helps me to extend the set out and reach more true muscular failure versus just trying to crank them all out in one shot.
So would you say when you do that, is your set a 10? Do you feel like you're leaving anything in the tank there? Or do you feel like, ready to stop?
Strength wise, I could keep going, but it's just that burn, like what Brad is probably experiencing. Like that burn is just getting to me. So I know I'm gonna end up like starting to try to cheat reps, like toss it, versus more controlled. So to stay in control, I just take those rest pauses to maintain composure, and poise.
Yeah, it's a good technique. I use a lot of rest pause for isolation stuff. Just because I think that's a good way to go about it too. If you're not used to training to failure, start with isolation movements and maybe even rest pause, because it can kind of give you a good idea. You know, if you're trying to push each set to 1 to 0 RIR, then you rest 10, 15 seconds, knock out a few more. Like it gives you a large degree of exposure to that feeling in a short period of time.
It'll probably keep most people more composed too, because they're catching their breath a little bit, letting some of that lactic acid dissipate a little bit.
Let some of that clear out. Yeah. We got kind of on a tangent there and away from our RIR, RPE, but it's actually really good in my opinion, because we just had like a good, 10, maybe 15-minute conversation about really good, effective training. And I don't think we mentioned RIR or RPE at all. I mean, so I think it's kind of, it was a good thing that kind of happened, because it's not one of those things that, like you said, Brian, at the very beginning, it is so easy to just way overthink it. And I think I would like to hear you, Brian, talk about what we talked about before we started the call, is just a simple way to look at that with the red light, green light approach. So, I think that is such a key take home.
So Jacob Skepis, he's one of the owners of JPS Fitness in Australia, friend of the team. I know over there, and I may get some of the finer details of this wrong, but I believe when they're teaching some of their novice athletes proximity to failure and RIR, and like rather than saying, okay, this is a 4 RIR, they use kind of a light system. So like a red light, green light, or red light, yellow light, green light. So red light would be like a hard set. Yellow would be probably in that like 5 to 3 RIR type range. And then green is like warm up, very submaximal. And honestly, I think that's probably sufficient for advanced athletes even. I don't think there's much of a difference, or the effort that you go to trying to decide was that a 3 or a 4 RIR is better spent on other shit, in my opinion. Like it's not worth splitting hairs over. And we can't pretend that we know that what the magnitude of difference is between something that close. And so, yeah, just kind of, was this easy, moderately difficult, or hard? You know, and I think that's kind of is complicated as it needs to get to really get the basic value of that system in place. And then as you get better, Like I think being more precise is especially beneficial for powerlifters. So for just kind of as an example, using RPE with a powerlifter as they close in on a meet can be really useful for planning attempt selection for meets. And so the difference between an 8 and a 9 probably does make a difference for them, because an 8 is probably a little bit heavier than an opener. A 9 is probably a solid second attempt, and so if I have somebody working up to a single at a 9, that's going to be kind of what we have as the anchor for like a plan A second. And so when they go for an opener, usually an opener is like that 90 to 92-ish%, kind of correlates for most people to like a 7.5 RPE. Something you could, to borrow a term from Berto back from like 2011, I think he said, think of your opener as something you can triple like in the middle of a blizzard, like standing outside, something you can triple in the worst circumstances. And I think that's kind of a good way to think about it. But I think, it can help for planning reasons too, for diagnostic reasons, rather than just achieving the stimulus. And I guess on the flip side, one of the advantages from a diagnostic front, training to failure and keeping technique strict and everything standardized, is that it's much easier to assess your program if it's working or not. So you're not BSing yourself on, okay, did I get 1 rep stronger? Did I just try harder that set than I did the session before? So training, pretty close to failure, something that you can comfortably standardize. Training to 0 to 1 RIR is going to be much easier to consistently do than training to 4 RIR, just because it's harder to gauge, So like if you're seeing performance trend up over time and, you're taking things close to failure, you don't need to really worry too much about like overhauling anything. Like the objectives being met, you're managing fatigue if you're able to actually increase performance over time. So I see a lot of people, they see concepts like this and things are working for them. Like the person that asked this question, he's been making gains that he's happy with using percentage-based programming. It's like that, just keep doing what's working until it doesn't work, and then look at an alternative. And like you can incorporate it in conjunction with percentage-based training using like a table like that I talked about. But at the end of the day, like RIR and percentages are striving to reach the same objective, and that's achieving like a physiological stimulus that's going to move us forward. So some of it is just RIR is probably better for more advanced athletes. But even then, I use it in conjunction. Do you guys have anything else?
Yeah, I thought that was really, not really. But the thorough guy in me kind of wants to summarize, but at the same time, it's like I feel like you need a summary, just go back and hit the timestamps or something like that. But I just feel like that was an important thing to just kind of simplify it. Red light, yellow light, green light, take into the other considerations, make sure you're actually letting the muscle do the work and to fail, and things like that. And yeah, I just felt like that was the perfect way to put a little bow on top of the present, And
I think the debate between camps, training to failure, RIR, percentages, like anybody can make their argument favorable for them without proper context. So like there's everything is a tool that you can use. You don't have to buy into one strategy over another. It's all has its place. So anything else, Jeff?
I think I left one in reserve on this podcast. Maybe I'm at failure. It's pretty close.
I'm hitting a 0 RIR because I have this hoodie on and I'm sweating my ass off. But
so I think I think I got a pretty good stimulus. I don't think I left 4 in the tank. That's for sure. So true. I think we're good.
All right. Well, thank you everybody for listening, and we'll catch you next time.